Welcome to somewhere partially underground on this continent. Tonight I have a teaching entitled My Experience with the Word of Faith. If you'd like to follow along, you can open up your Bible to Romans chapter 1. I'll be reading verse 17. For therein is the righteousness of God revealed from faith to faith. As it is written, the just shall live by faith. A few years ago, I was stumbling for a moment because I wrote this sermon a few years ago, but I'm redoing it. So there was a pastor, visited a church. He had his credentials in a mainstream Pentecostal denomination, but alternative atmosphere with, the lights down and fog machines and stuff like that. And that was okay. I didn't mind that. After the service, he did a really great job. He did like the old-fashioned pastors, going to the back of the church and trying to greet people after you speak. And it was a good sermon, but ultimately at the end of the day, there were bigger doses from the Word of Faith theology than I would like. When you eat a meal, sometimes some people can detect certain spices, and the same thing is with a sermon. And there are certain views and theological positions that shape every teacher. And so I'd like to look at, first of all, what does this term Word of Faith mean? I was a pastor in Phoenix who was a Word of Faith pastor, and he told me, I'm really upset with people like you because you believe in faith too, but it's a slang term that got developed and grew that was a good way to describe a theological group of people whose doctrines they agree on without really being a religious corporation. Assemblies of God, Foursquare, Southern Baptist, these are groups that each license ministers. These are what we call denominations. Some groups, like some Calvary Chapel, especially some old school Calvary Chapel people, like to use the word fellowship. And they get upset if you call them a denomination, like you offended them. Now, like Calvary Chapel pastor I was talking to who was upset at me for calling it a denomination, he was right. It is a fellowship of believers that get together, but it's also a denomination where they are credentialed through that organization. Now, the Word of Faith doesn't have a denomination, if you will, where they're credentialed, but there are churches that group together that think a lot alike and they hang out together. Some of the common core topics are confession, prosperity, rhema, logos, the two different Greek words and what those things mean, seed faith, and then emphasizing faith, to name a few. Now, if your church or your pastor has incorporated some of these things, and not necessarily, but if you hear more and more and more in this pushing and driving to saying the right thing and different things, you're probably on your way to being a Word of Faith church. There was a church, a church I had issues with. It was a card-carrying Word of Faith church, card-carrying, and I don't know where the phrase came from, but it means that's really what you are. Some people are card-carrying Republicans, some people are card-carrying Democrats, some people are card-carrying Libertarians, because in the old days they'd send you out a card for what party you signed up for. Well, this was a Word of Faith church. I had some friends there, so I'd hang out there sometimes, and this man's, a relative of his would come, and his relative was kind of a jerk. And a family in that church had a tragedy. And some of this family who gave this church a lot of money. They gave me a lot of money. Some people in their family died in a horrible accident. And so, what did this church do? Did they put their arm around them and just sit there and cry? We don't know what to say. No, they drove them out of the church for lacking faith. And if you had faith, that wouldn't have happened. This is there was a top 10 horrible experiences inside the church. And like J. Vernon McGee says, the devil goes to church. So this individual that was related to the pastor, and however this whole thing came down, well, I was on a newsletter, snail mail newsletter of this relative of this pastor of this church. And a year later or something like that, they're begging for money because he didn't have health insurance, and he got into a horrible accident. Now, I didn't say to him, send a letter like, if he had faith that wouldn't have happened. I looked at the stuff, and yeah, welcome to the real world. And it was a sad situation, and both these individuals had some experiences that was the life of hard knocks, teaching them about some of the drawbacks of this theological position. And the one pastor did sort of walk back some of the Word of Faith stuff, but I don't think enough. Matthew 11:28-30. Come unto me, O ye that labor and heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn of me, for I am meek and lowly in heart, and ye shall find rest unto your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. You can apply this to any church, but the Word of Faith movement imposes a system upon people. And it makes people really fearful of being careful what they do. There was a church in a major city, and there was a Word of Faith church, large church, and there was another large church, and it was just an old school Baptist, helping people, ministering to people, just loving people. Well, this Baptist church, and I'm not sure the denomination, it was more non-denominational, but I think his credentials was through a Baptist denomination of some sort. And he said he would get people from this church because they were too embarrassed to ask for help from that church. So, this theology, which focuses on that if you're suffering, it's a sign. I got other stories, but I got a very short teaching, so Um, but that suffering is a sin, and if you suffer, it's because of your lack of faith. People whose babies have died, well, that's lack of faith. I mean, these people are downright cruel. It imposes a system of man, a man-made created system to make money and teach not to suffer for Christ. And I don't know what they do with 2 Timothy 3:12, 1:13, and 2:12. I was at a conference a million years ago, and a pastor, I don't know how he got onto Word of Faith, especially this one particular guy who I kind of liked, and I even quote from him sometimes. But this pastor sent this gentleman a letter and said, you know, I've been watching you on TV, and I'm seeing all these people with glasses. And this brother, who I liked, he sent back a letter to this pastor and said, well, brother, keep your eyes on God, not on man. And it's funny when people go off on a trip on people about suffering, criticizing their suffering, criticizing the kind of car they have. And if you're not healed, it's your fault you're not healed. Well, no, you shouldn't be up in the pulpit. If you're a Word of Faith person and you really lay a trip on people about if you're sick, it's your fault. I mean, you're supposed to be healed, and you're wearing glasses. I heard this on YouTube from a young man who has a YouTube channel. I totally agree with the statement. Don't trust a Word of Faith preacher wearing glasses, because glasses is a degenerative of the eyes. It's something you deal with, and so we will all die. This mortal body will come to an end at some point. No faith preacher is going to out-confess or confess their way out of that. Hebrews 11:39. Hebrews 11:39. Oh, got to mark it. Here, 11:39. These all, and this is the hall of fame for faith, and the great works and things that the people of faith did, of showing what faith is. And then the writer of this book, and I'm thinking it was Paul, but maybe not, and more modern people's views are not so much Paul, but all these, now how many is all these? All these, having obtained a good report through faith, receive not the promise, God having provided some better thing for us, that they without us should not be made perfect. And here the writer gives a balanced view and tells about both sides. The writer could have gone off, but he didn't go off on a Word of Faith tangent. It's your fault. He didn't do that. God's will has a plan. God's will has a providence. Acts. Look at Acts chapter 2. Chapter 12. Verse 12. And he killed James, the brother of John, with the sword. Verse 5. Peter therefore was kept in prison, but prayer was made without ceasing of the church unto God for him. Verse 14 and 15. And when she knew Peter's voice, she opened not the gate for gladness, but ran in and told how Peter stood before the gate. And they said unto her, Thou art mad. But she consistently affirmed, I saw him. I saw him. James and Peter have been arrested. James is executed, and the angel of the Lord, you could read in these other verses here in Acts 12, released Peter from jail. Now, I've heard people in the Word of Faith community say, well, the reason, and it's been a lot of years, so maybe today they wouldn't feel this way, they'd be more balanced out, but the thought is, well, if the people had prayed when James was arrested, then he would have been released too. But their faith, they like putting your money in a machine and you pull this lever and something comes out. And you pray, they prayed, and Peter came out. Well, that's not the text of the story, because in 14 and 50, these prayer warriors were such great faith, pistis, absolutely no doubt, pistuo, we believe, absolutely no doubt. If that was the case, when Peter knocked on the door, they would have said, come in, brother, you're late. We were expecting you, because we are great people of faith. And we were expecting you. They didn't do that. The one lady that answered knew Peter's voice, and she says, this is creepy, this is not real. And she went back and told the rest of the great people of faith, the great people of faith. And they said, you're crazy. She says, no, I know it's Peter. They said, you're crazy. There was no faith there. There's not enough faith to believe you weighed out of a wet paper sack. It was the providence of God that one was allowed to die and the other one was to live. A quick story. I was at kind of a volunteer at a youth baseball clinic. It was put on by some gentleman. I don't know if the gentleman put it on, played professional baseball, but it was more of an off-season camp, fundamentals camp. I mean, it wasn't any, it was kind of it was a big event. There was a lot of people there, and it was through a course of a week. But they did things like catching a frisbee with a hole in it for like outfielders. And there were just different things they did and drills. And just a lot of it was just fun stuff. And I came up to them with two tracks. Dave DeVecchi and Oral Hershiser. Oral Hershiser in 1988. Great Christian testimony. Led the Dodgers to the World Series. The famous Kirk Gibson home run where he couldn't walk. If he had got a base hit, it probably would have lost him the game. They might have lost the series. And then the next year, Dave DeVecchi, the opposite, the James side of the story. He lost his arm to cancer. The earthquake in the World Series. A real earthquake. And two different stories. Both Dave DeVecchi and Oral Hershiser were great testimonies. When I gave this guy a track from each one of these, about each one of these, they didn't write the track, and I gave it to him. He looked at me for a moment, and I could tell that look. He didn't want it. I knew he wasn't a believer, but he took them, and he says, well, I will say this. These are really two great human beings. And so I tell that story, and I think about this in Acts 12, that one glorified God, the James way, and then another glorified God, the Peter way. They both glorified God. And I wish that all my Word of Faith friends and every Word of Faith person could be balanced with that extreme theology. The Word of Faith people have done some good things. If you listen to all of my teachings online, you see things that I've copied from the Word of Faith. Genesis 3. A number of Word of Faith preach about Adam and Eve and the lease. They gave the title deed of the earth to to Satan. But so I think they have that right more than any other theological movement. When people say God has everything under control, we have to qualify that. And I think they have the best explanation, the Word of Faith, of this whole suffering thing. So, Lord, I pray for everyone who's listened to this, and if someone's a Word of Faith, I thank them for listening to this, Lord, but we need a balance, and we need a healing from the lives that have been devastated by this radicalism in the Word of Faith movement, and try to have an balanced understanding of prosperity and suffering for Christ. Lord, signing off from somewhere underground. Good night.